Band breakups are unfortunately part of the DNA of rock and roll. And if you look at the Mount Rushmore of breakups, it probably starts with the Beatles. Cause of death, a rare Asian virus known as the Yoko Ono. Fast forward about a decade, and the pioneers of heavy metal, Black Sabbath, break up. Cause of death, Cocaneus tyrannius. That's Latin. Loosely translated, snorting cocaine for a decade can sometimes bring out very antisocial behaviors. Just a few years later, legendary band Pink Floyd broke up. Cause of death, Psychedelius eruptus, meaning old man on an acid trip yelling at clouds. I mean, let's be serious here. Does even Roger Waters know why he's upset anymore? And finally, the band we're talking about tonight, Van Halen. Cause of death, celebrity fatale. Translation, a lot of personality, too much personality for one spotlight. Unfortunately, in the year 1984, we were all partying and cranking up the Van Halen music so loud, we didn't hear the faint cry of the bartender yelling, "Last call for alcohol." That's right, ladies and gentlemen, 1984, the last hurrah of Van Halen. Next. Welcome, metal enthusiasts, to another episode of The Metal Dude Abides. Tonight we're talking about the year 1984, and you can't talk about the year 1984 without talking about the album 1984. And even though technically Van Halen breaks up in 1985, talking about the end of one of the greatest bands in hard rock and heavy metal history. And even though 1984 is the last hurrah, the swan song, if you will, of the original Van Halen, what we find out is that there was signs all along that things weren't going well. I guess the first time as a fan I sensed trouble in the Van Halen camp was I read an article in Hit Parader where they were talking about to David Lee Roth about, well, let's just say Eddie Van Halen wasn't real happy with him because he had been off on an Amazon river excursion, and Eddie Van Halen was kind of ready to start a new album for Van Halen. Eddie was a little grumpy with David Lee Roth, and they were asking David Lee Roth about this, and David Lee Roth basically said, look, I do this. I get all this money so I can go out and experience things. I go and do things while Eddie sits around and buys things and sits and looks at the things, his possessions that he buys. That's his thing. I'm going to go out and do things. It's my rainbow. Hop on, get off. I don't care. And that's kind of the first time like I had heard an interview where it seemed like there was some pretty interesting personality splits within Van Halen. But apparently, the riff starts much sooner. There was the infamous photo shoot for the album cover, Women and Children First, where David Lee Roth hires his own photographer. Photographer's taking all sorts of pictures about David Lee Roth, and the rest of the band's like, we're not using any of that. They fired the photographer, got their own photographer, a little bit of a skirmish there. But really, I think what starts to happen is a change of musical direction. So let's start with Eddie is really wanting to move away from the lighter Van Halen style to a heavier, darker style. Now, Eddie Van Halen's kind of right in that early 80s period, metal is coming on, a lot more heavy music is becoming popular. He comes out with, Women and Children First, but in particularly the album following that, Fair Warning. Eddie, wanted to go in a much heavier, darker direction, a direction that David Lee Roth did not necessarily agree with. And once again, I agreed with Eddie. I really liked this heavier, darker direction. Fair warning, one of my favorite Van Halen albums. But unfortunately, David Lee Roth was also kind of right in that when you look at the sales of Fair Warning, you can see that the fans kind of agreed with David Lee Roth and didn't really gravitate to this new, heavier sound that Eddie Van Halen wanted to do. So kind of in the round one of creative differences, round one kind of goes to David Lee Roth because there's clearly the sales of their albums. And it's kind of funny because Fair Warning sells 2 million copies, but that's a far cry from the 10 million copies that Van Halen 1 sold. Now, one of the arguments David Lee Roth made was he really liked doing a lot of different covers. And in some ways, David Lee Roth is correct in that Van Halen was one of the best bands to do cover songs, really of all time. Because of the unbelievable guitar skills of Eddie Van Halen and the way they compose things, Van Halen was one of those bands that could take just an ordinary cover song and really make it their own. So David Lee Roth realized, why go to all this work? We can just take an old song that was good and make it better and make it our own, adopt it, and change it to the Van Halen style. But Eddie Van Halen was also right. He was tired of doing covers. He wanted to become known as a more serious artist and make his own compositions. Now, after Fair Warning's kind of lackluster performance, Van Halen decided maybe we need to take a break. After all, they'd put together 4 albums in like 5-6 years, and just one right after another. So they compromised by saying, we'll do a cover song to tide the fans over till we're ready to make the new album. So they did a cover of the song Roy Orbison classic, Pretty Woman. But the record label kind of pushed and kind of hemmed and kind of hawed and said, we really want you to put out another album. So once again, Eddie Van Halen was forced to kind of compromise and go in a direction David Lee Roth wanted, because they didn't have time to put together all new material. So they produced the album Diver Down. Diver Down had like 5 or 6 covers on it. It was almost all written by other people. But unfortunately, once again, David Lee Roth was kind of right in that Diver Down was commercially much more successful than the heavier albums Women and Children First and Fair Warning had been. All of a sudden, Eddie Van Halen started to realize David Lee Roth is starting to win this argument. Creative control is starting to slide away from where I want it to be. And just from my perspective, Eddie's right. Diver Down is an abomination. Can't stand that album. Don't understand why. Like, I had to double check those figures. Like, are you telling me, like, Diver Down sold like 3 times as many albums as Fair Warning? It sold like 7 million copies. I couldn't believe it when I saw that, because I think Diver Down is by far the worst Van Halen album ever made. So you kind of get the feeling Eddie Van Halen, after the lackluster sales of the albums and the direction he wanted to go, now all of a sudden has the nightmare of having an album full of covers do so well. David Lee Roth now is starting to pull creative control for Van Halen. Now, even though it seemed like Van Halen was being pulled in the David Lee Roth direction, true to their form and why they put out Diver Down in the first place, the band took a break. Once again, David Lee Roth went off exploring the world. Eddie Van Halen was putting the finishing touches on his studio, 5150 Studios. Now, here's back to kind of that tug and pull of creative direction and personalities. Van Halen was notorious for blowing in, getting into the studio, creating an album in just a matter of days. David Lee Roth hated going into the studio. He liked performing music live. He liked, again, going off and exploring the world. He didn't want to be cooped up in a studio. Flip that on its head. Eddie Van Halen has built his own studio where he wants to spend so much time in it creating and I think Eddie Van Halen also really wanted to be considered as a legitimate musician and a composer. So not only is Eddie Van Halen in creating his own studio, he's starting to collaborate with other superstars. He does the guitar solo for Michael Jackson on the song Beat It. He does a soundtrack for a movie. So he's off doing all this composing work, not something that Van Halen necessarily was all enthralled about, especially David Lee Roth. Now, David Lee Roth comes back from his world, tromping around. We're ready to make a new album. And lo and behold, he has the nightmare of finding out that Eddie Van Halen has picked up the keyboards. Now here, I have to full-heartedly agree with David Lee Roth. David Lee Roth is like, wait. What in the hell are we doing this for? Listen, every moment that Eddie Van Halen played the keyboards, it was taking him away from his God-given talent as a protege of the guitar. I agree completely with David Lee Roth. I thought Eddie Van Halen moving to a keyboard-heavy sound was to me, was a huge disappointment. I think any metal band that was really kind of experimenting with a heavy synthesized sound at this time, 90% of the time, I didn't agree with that direction. They weren't very good at it. I've talked a lot about this with the Ren. We've talked about this in that keyboards at that time were just kind of an electronic piano. And it really, I'm sorry, but Eddie Van Halen's playing on that was like not very sophisticated in my humble opinion. I don't play the piano or the keyboards, but it was like dun 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 dun. Like it seemed very simplistic. Whereas if you listen to Eddie Van Halen playing guitar, it was dynamic and sophisticated. And so I agree with David Lee Roth. I thought it was a disaster in the makings to have Eddie Van Halen moving 1 second away from guitars and moving to keyboards. But Eddie Van Halen was kind of right, because he puts this very simplistic keyboard shell over the song Jump, and it becomes the biggest selling hit in the history of Van Halen, the first Van Halen song to go #1. David Lee Roth is now forced with Eddie Van Halen starting to again exert control of the creative direction, as he just now produced a #1 hit. Now, luckily for us in 1984, I thought this album was going to be a complete bust, to tell you the truth. Again, not at all happy with the direction of Jump. But luckily for people like myself, there was still a lot of David Lee Roth in this album. 1984 was kind of an interesting blend, again, of that creative tension, because you had the Jump synthesizer heavy song that Eddie Van Halen liked. You kind of had the, it's like the Three Little Bears, and then you had the bombastic Hot for Teacher, featuring blazing guitar solos and all of David Lee Roth's personality. And then you had that chord was just right, where it kind of blended the two styles. A song like Panama, which was more accustomed to some of the older music Van Halen had put together back in the day. So this Van Halen 1984 album had a little bit of everything. However, it was clear, because Van Halen Jump was such a success, it seemed like the David Lee Roth version of the band was starting to be ebbing again, and once again, the Eddie Van Halen version of the band was starting to surge again. Frustrated by this, David Lee Roth says, you know what? I think I'll go out and do a solo project. 1984 was a huge commercial success. Van Halen was back and was one of the biggest bands on planet Earth. 1984, which featured prominent ideas of both David Lee Roth and Eddie Van Halen, blended the two styles perfectly. This album sells over 10 million copies. But the fallout of that is creative control of the band has never been more of a toss-up. So David Lee Roth decides he needs to make a move. So he goes out and puts out an EP called Crazy from the Heat. Not only does he put out this EP, but he puts out some accompanying videos to go with it. Now, we've talked about this before. In the 1980s, it wasn't just enough to put out good music. It was also very important to be able to put out together these videos representation, the video and the song together could make a viral hit, if you will. And that's exactly what happened here. Now, I complained a lot about Diver Down as being just kind of silly. It didn't come off as being very serious. But apparently it wasn't silly enough, because David Lee Roth returned to that style of format. This EP had nothing but cover songs, nothing but silliness, and it worked. His first video and single was the old Beach Boys classic, I Wish They All Could Be California Girls. I haven't sat down and counted them, but the most women in bikinis ever portrayed in a single video. You could say he broke the Guinness Book of World Records, most tits per second in a major music video. It worked. Now, David Lee Roth is not just the biggest rock star in the world, he's one of the biggest celebrities in the world. He's transmuted himself. He's not just big in metal, he's not just big in hard rock, he is one of the biggest celebrities on planet Earth. He follows that up with an old Louis Prima song, I'm Just a Gigolo, and the side to that is I Ain't Got No Body. This video, if you want to see the 80s at their most ridiculous, this video may top it. Because David Lee Roth is dancing around. He's got all these different personas. He lampoons all the different music of the day. He makes fun of Cyndi Lauper. He makes fun of Billy Idol. He makes fun of Richard Simmons. The PMRC gets a Willie Nelson Culture Club. He gets everybody. This is one of the most funny videos you'll ever see, and delivered in that tongue-in-cheek style that only David Lee Roth could figure. All of a sudden, David Lee Roth looks like he's right, because his form of what Van Halen was has exploded. Unfortunately, at this point, this is probably the impetus for David Lee Roth going, wait a minute, I'm doing what I think Van Halen should do. Maybe this is what I should continue to do moving forward. Just a year after all the success of 1984, David Lee Roth becomes the biggest celebrity on planet Earth and becomes bigger than Van Halen. So I guess the writing was on the wall in permanent marker. It was just a matter of time now before the band split up. And sure enough, in 1985, David Lee Roth walked in one day and told Van Halen the sad news that he was no longer interested in being their singer and was going to go off on his solo career. David Lee Roth then went out and formed one of the greatest supergroups ever put together. He brought in one of the most legendary guitar players of all time, Steve Vai, and he brought in bassist Billy Sheehan. Now, I did a video just a few months ago about the Mount Rushmore of bass players. And while Billy Sheehan didn't make the top 4, he probably would have made it if I had made a top 5. Billy Sheehan is an amazing bass player. Anyway, they put out an album called Eat 'Em and Smile. And this is typical David Lee Roth lunacy. And it's fun, and it's partying, and it features a picture of David Lee Roth in like a headhunter outfit. Loads of funny videos. If you've ever seen the video where he's, I want a bottle of anything and a jelly donut to go. I can't do David Lee Roth justice. You're going to have to go back in the archives and look at all those funny videos that he did. But it looked like David Lee Roth was correct, that this kind of party, silly, fun Van Halen was what people wanted. And sure enough, Eat 'Em and Smile sold 2 million copies. However, Van Halen wasn't done either. They went out and signed, perhaps you've heard of him, legendary singer Sammy Hagar. Now, Sammy Hagar, of course, started off with the band Montrose, but he had had a tremendous solo career A little bit underrated. I always talk about, if you really want to hear some good music that was a little underrated in its time, go back to the Sammy Hagar solo career, because it kind of gets sandwiched between Montrose and Van Halen a little bit. But Sammy Hagar had just come off a string of really good albums, and he had just had a big hit, I Can't Drive 55. So Sammy Hagar joins the band, and they kind of follow the Eddie Van Halen direction, much more serious, I don't know, much more adult, uh, again, a lot more synthesizers, a more mature sound, if you will. Um, and guess what? 5150 sells 6 million copies. Advantage, Eddie. David Lee Roth never really recovered from that. I think Eat 'Em and Smile was fun. I loved that album. But everything after that David Lee Roth did was just awful. Because I think what happened is I think David kind of panicked and said, well, maybe I could do an album like what Van Halen's doing, a little bit more serious. And he did that Living in Paradise song, and it was just like, no, don't go there. Because that wasn't who David Lee Roth was. That's not who we loved, right? So it just falls flat. And eventually the band members kind of come and go, and it just kind of fizzles off in a sad way. Meanwhile, Van Halen continues on with Sammy Hagar, makes, a few more really well-received albums. And so not only did Van Halen win that opening battle, ultimately they won the war. Now, we all know that a few years later, Van Halen's going to go through all of this again with Sammy Hagar and kick him out of the band. And we all know David Lee Roth's come in and out of the band a few times since then. So there's more saga in the future, but we'll save that for another video. What we all wanted to talk about was, of course, Eddie Van Halen's great guitar playing. And so now we get to see what the best instrumental performances for guitars, drums, and bass were for 1984, and see if Eddie Van Halen made the cut. All right, for those of you familiar with the channel, we award every year Best Instrumental Performance. While I tend to have a favoritism towards guitar, we also do one for bass and for drums. So, without further ado, Best Bass Performance from 1984 goes to Metallica, For Whom the Bell Tolls. Cliff Burton, there's just no words to describe what an impact he had on heavy metal. You could pick a number of different songs off this album. I chose For Whom the Bell Tolls because he does an amazing intro on this song on the bass. For years, I thought it was the guitar intro coming in. Come to find out it was the bass. This man is an absolute legend. He's an absolute genius, doing things on the bass that no one had ever been able to recreate. Best drumming performance of the year also goes to Metallica and Lars Ulrich for the song Fight Fire with Fire. We're going to talk a little bit more about this great album in a couple of weeks, but just know that right now, Metallica is the greatest heavy metal band on planet Earth. Best bass player, best drums. Let's see if they also pull it in for best guitar. So let's go for the 5 nominees for Best Instrumental Performance of 1984. Our first nominee, Yngwie Malmsteen, with his song Icarius Suite, Dream Suite Opus number 5. Boy, Yngwie Malmsteen has been shackled with these heavy metal bands that want to perform a much more commercial form of metal. So he finally decides to heck with this. I'm going to do my own thing. And he comes out swinging. One of the most legendary guitar albums of all time. If you've never heard this album, I know it wasn't on Spotify for a number of years. That has been recently rectified. Go out and check it out. It is amazing. You'll want to take it home and put it into your collection for sure. At one point, and there's some legendary songs on this album. I picked this one because essentially Yngwie Malmsteen plays an entire orchestra on a guitar. Tremendous work. Our second nominee, you know they were going to get in here, Metallica with their song Fade to Black. One thing that I have to be really careful about is focusing way too much on Kirk Hammett, because I love his guitar solos. This guy, trained under Joe Satriani, really knows how to shred, really like Kirk Hammett's style of playing, but also James Hetfield. Don't sleep on his playing on this album and this song. It is great. This song, a little bit of a slower song from Metallica, it is one of their all-time best. Our second nominee, Metallica with Fade to Black. Our third nominee, Iron Maiden with Rime of the Ancient Mariner. I do love a good English lit brought to heavy metal. And this, I think, Samuel Taylor Caldwell album or poem makes for the perfect vehicle for one of the best long heavy metal songs in history. As I always say, I'm not a big fan of 10-minute plus songs, but this is one of those exceptions. One of the most legendary epic songs of all time, 13 and a half minutes, and it just blows by like it's a 5-minute song. One of the great compositions in the history of Iron Maiden. Our third nominee, Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Our fourth nominee, Dokken, and their song, Into the Fire. Now, I had to arm wrestle back and forth between Into the Fire and Just Got Lucky, because I believe two of the most legendary guitar solos from the great George Lynch. Tooth and Nail, by far my favorite Dokken album, and again, some of the best work George Lynch ever did right here on this album. Absolutely legendary stuff. George Lynch has just blown onto the scene a year ago, already establishing himself as one of the greatest guitarists of this generation. And finally, our fifth nominee, we just got through talking about it. Eddie Van Halen throws the keyboards away for 5 seconds and produces one of the best jams of his career. I love the solo in Hot for Teacher. It is our fifth nominee. Again, this is what I want from my Van Halen music. This is just Eddie just tearing it up. One of those legendary, one of my favorite songs in the whole Van Halen discography. Our fifth nominee, Hot for Teacher. And the winner is Yngwie Malmsteen with Vicarious Dream Suite Opus number 5. Listen, I love these. All of these songs are tremendous. All of them have, the guitarists show such great, tremendous skill. But at the end of the day, nobody, and I mean nobody, can compete with the opening salvo of one Yngwie J. Malmsteen. I said a couple of episodes ago, when he shows up, the king has arrived. Even to this day, I don't hear anybody out there that really competes and sounds like Yngwie Malmsteen, one of the most talented guitarists of all time, and one of the most original. Now, the Grammys that year, kind of an interesting choice. They went with a song from the band Yes called Cinema. Now, I'm going to say right off the bat, I'm not a real big fan of progressive 70s and now 80s rock. I've tried Yes on a number of occasions, and I'll be honest, I just don't get it. I remember one of my buddies in high school, we went to separate colleges, we came back together, and he was listening to Yes, and I looked at him like he had been, taken by the invasion of the body snatchers. And I'm like, what are you listening to this crap for, right? I get it, right? It's probably very good music. It's just something that doesn't do anything for me, but I understand from a lot of people that Yes is a very great band musically. However, I will pick Nits again because this song, Cinema, is like 2 minutes long. I listened to it. It was okay, whatever. But I don't understand how, in a year where Yngwie Malmsteen is putting together this kind of barrage of the senses, that you would even consider Yes in this boat. So I don't think Yes should have won it. But two other things, and we talk about this. Also, We are talking about the era of Stevie Ray Vaughan. Now, Stevie Ray Vaughan and Yngwie Malmsteen, that's kind of an interesting comparison because they play very different styles. But Stevie Ray Vaughan is a badass. And how you can overlook Stevie Ray Vaughan for a second year in a row now, he's been a nominee, but that they just kind of passed over for something much lesser, in my opinion. How they could, I mean, maybe they don't know anything about Yngwie Malmsteen. It's the Grammy Awards. They don't know anything about metal. But they obviously have heard Stevie Ray Vaughan and are still passing him over for yes. That's a crime against humanity. And once again shows that the Grammy Awards have no idea what they're doing. But one more nitpick, also very hidden in here, is a nomination for Eddie Van Halen for a song called Donut City. I had to do a double take. I'm like, Donut City? What the hell is this? Well, apparently Eddie Van Halen did the soundtrack for an album called The Wildlife. One of those movies that came, went, nothing to see here, citizens, I suppose. And he has a song on there called Donut City. And I listened to it. And once again, Eddie Van Halen's off in his studio, fidgeting and digiting. This is basically Eddie Van Halen scratching his tuchus for a couple of minutes and just playing around with synthesizers and guitar sounds and everything. And it kind of pissed me off because I'm sitting here thinking, wait a minute. You have been sitting here in the shadow of greatness for pretty much a decade where Eddie Van Halen was playing some of the best and most innovative guitar work in the history. Van Halen wasn't hidden. This isn't like a niche metal band. This is one of the biggest bands on Metal Earth. And you have not given that man 1 ounce of credit this entire time. And now, because he's over there fiddling with a few dials in a studio, you're going to give him a Grammy nomination for Donut City? I would say something, but it would be not nice in polite company. That's how enraged I am by the absolute sheer audacity and stupidity of the people that pick the Grammy Awards every year. That you could ignore greatness and then reward mediocrity from the same person. This is the kind of crap that caused Eddie Van Halen to stop playing these great guitar solos and fidgeting around with these synthesizers and crap we don't need. And yes, now all of a sudden the Grammys have another award. We'll talk about a little rock performance. And of course, they award Jump. I'm not sure what language I can use on YouTube, so I'm just going to leave it there. But no, Donut City did not deserve a nomination. Jump did not deserve a nomination. Yes did not deserve the award that year. So you can take your pick, Stevie Ray Vaughan or Yngwie Malmsteen. And there, my friends, that is who should be bringing in the awards every year. Grammys, once again, you missed the mark by a wide margin. And that's our show. We are almost through the year 1984, but we're going to be talking about the best hard rock and heavy metal songs and albums of the year the next couple of weeks, so you don't want to miss that. So right now, before you forget, hit the like, hit the subscribe, and you'll get alerted to my content going forward. Because we do this every Tuesday, and you don't want to miss an episode. You want to know who brings home the prize for best album of the year. You want to know who has the best song of the year. And you know, life, we get busy, and we forget about things. You don't want to be that person. So, set the alerts, and we'll see you back here next Tuesday night. In the meantime, this is the Metal Dude signing off. Take care.